Now, what does that mean for growth? What does it mean for the contribution of growth? Same countries here. Numbers that you see here at the top is the actual labor productivity growth that we are having over the period 95 to 2006. And what you see then is the contribution of these various intangibles to that labor productivity growth. So take the US again, labor productivity growth of 3%, and about 0.8 percentage point of that 3% is coming from investment in intangibles. So that's not small. That's a really big number in terms of what it is worth to invest in these intangibles in order to create overall GDP growth. And this is also true for lots of the other countries, but there seems to be a relationship to the intensity of the investments and the overall productivity growth that is taking place. So the main point to be made here is that innovation is not just something that drops as manna from heaven, as Solow, which Eric referred to earlier, has sometimes called it. It's something that exogenously happens to firms. It's not like that. Innovation is largely and almost entirely, I would argue, the result of investment, of an investment strategy that companies and regions and countries have in order to make innovation happen. So in summary, productivity growth and intangible investment together are the key components in order to get this economy growing again. It is the key component for advanced economies to be able to tap into that global growth that will be largely driven by the emerging economies. There can be incentives created for companies to actually strengthen their competencies of their workforce, to help them to and stimulate them to invest in organizational capital and innovation. And very importantly, this is not just about high-tech. High-tech is important, but it is really largely about the much broader intangible innovation processes that support investment and productivity growth across economies. With that being said, I think we again have a few minutes for questions, I guess. Right here is a question, and right at the back.
I don't know if speakers are allowed. So my question is, it seemed like a lot of your comparisons of labor productivity growth and TFP growth over time between advanced economies and developing economies led up to the recession, but then stopped or maybe went into 2008. And so one question is, I know in the U.S., this is a major issue right now, is that productivity surged in the recession unexpectedly. And the major question for is this going to be a jobless recovery or not is that something that was a one-time blip having to do with the recession itself, or is that a sustainable trend?
Right.
And so I guess I'd be interested in hearing what you think, if you think that is a sustainable trend, and if you think that the differences between the advanced economies and emerging economies, those gaps leading up to the recession, if that's changing going forward.
Right. It's a great question, and one of the slides that I did not produce, but that I did have as a backup, is actually showing that relationship about this very rapid productivity growth. This is the United States, and the blue line is showing you the labor productivity growth and the performance of employment. And what we have seen in the United States is that indeed you see that slowing down of productivity growth since 2005 that I've been talking about. And then suddenly, during the recession in 2009, we saw it coming back up again. Now, where does that come from? Well, in the short term, it really was directly related to the fact that we had this huge decline in terms of hours worked. So we had a decline of minus 5% in hours worked in 2009. About half of that was coming from slashing jobs, and another half of that was coming from cutting labor hours from people who were actually still on the payroll. So it was a huge amount of labor decline. As I mentioned earlier, in my view, somewhat of an overreaction, at least relative to the decline in output that was kind of pushing up this productivity growth. And it's interesting to compare this with Europe. And now the dotted line is still the US, and the solid lines are now Europe. In the case of Europe, you see that, yes, hours have also declined, but much less than in the case of the United States. And productivity growth has actually fallen in the case of Europe to minus 1%, which is kind of the normal thing that happens during recessions. Now, the big question, of course, is what's now going to happen coming out of this? what we are seeing in 2010, still kind of a recovery year, is that we are beginning to see some of that labor growth recovering, but it will still likely to be very slow. And the reason why it is very difficult to answer what that is now going to mean is because there are really, I think, two trends going on. One trend is the trend in manufacturing, where we have lost a lot of jobs, both in the US and in Europe, but particularly in the case of the United States. And a lot of these jobs are unlikely to come back. Some of them will come back. Some of them are actually coming back right now. But the huge productivity gains made during 2009, and a lot of these productivity gains were the result of the fact that companies really could apply the technology and the innovation they had in-house to reduce their labor force. That, of course, is not going to go away, so that kind of recovery will not be there. The big question is what's going to happen to the growth of jobs in the services sector of the economy. And again, there are two parts of the economy here. One is the sort of market services part of the economy, where the real question is, are there still new innovations out there in the same way as in the early 2000s that helped at that time to get the retail sector and the finance sector and those market services growing? Is there still a lot more that these companies can do? If not, they may actually create a bit more labor, but if these innovations are there, labor growth will be slow. And then there's the non-market part of the economy, healthcare, education, where we have major sort of growth programs taking place, which might actually lead to the growth of more jobs. And the big question is how productive these jobs will be, and that, of course, will strongly depend on the innovations that are going to be applied in that part of the economy. So huge uncertainties there. The long-term trend is a trend towards more innovation, but the question is whether it will be labor-saving innovation or whether it will be innovation that is kind of creating new economic activities that will help the creation of more jobs. Was the question, two questions at the back, there's one over there. You decide how many we can take.
So how do you measure productivity in the financial sector? And tell me why that isn't a large negative number based on performance in the last 10 years.
Very good question. And a question that certainly is the part of a lot of debate right now. And some people indeed are arguing that a lot of the growth in the financial sector wasn't real, but was really the result of a lot of sort of undesirable, if you like, economic activity. To answer the question, you really need to partly look at measurement issues. How are we actually measuring financial output? And the second question to ask ourselves is, even if we measure it right, should we treat it as output growth or not? So there's a more sort of substantive question. But on the measurement question, I have to be very short here. But there are basically two ways you can measure financial output. One is to actually try to price and measure any services that are fee-based, which is good because we get more fee-based services in the financial sector, and we can actually price and measure these reasonably well. But we still have a lot of financial sector activity where we don't have a real price for it. So the way it's measured is basically take the difference between the interest paid and the interest received, and that, of course, is a very crude method of measuring it. Overall, there's still a lot of debate about people who are into this kind of measurement thing. Overall, the suggestion is yes, there is probably a certain amount of overstatement there, but we really shouldn't overdo this. And also when you do the international comparisons, it's not at all clear that the problem in the United States would be any bigger than it is in other parts of the economy. So we have to be very cautious on the measurement side. I think the conceptual point is a much more important issue, and that is indeed what is the role of the financial sector in the economy, and are some of the innovations that we are talking about, have they really been good innovations in the way that they have been not only driving value creation and productivity growth in the financial industry, but also in other parts of the economy, and how this is actually going to work out. That would lend itself for a full seminar, but I think my overall bottom line is there has been productivity growth in the financial sector, there has been innovation. We've probably been overstating it somewhat, but if you add everything up, it is very hard to get away from the idea that the United States and other advanced economies have seen significant acceleration in productivity growth in that part of the economy too. I think we better move on. We have to move on? Okay. Thank you.